Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope everybody is doing well and keeping safe, and looking forward to today's webinar, how to leverage test automation to deliver on your business and quality goals. My name is Mark Lambert. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives here at Parasoft, and I am joined by two of our test automation experts, Nathan Jakubiak and Chris Colosimo, who will both be giving demonstrations as part of today's session. But before we jump into things, just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sure everybody is familiar with GoToWebinar and associated streaming platforms, but just make sure all the lines are muted. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. We'll be answering some of those as we go through today's session, but then also we'll have a little bit of time, hopefully at the end, for some Q&A as well. There are a number of different interactions that you can do. You can also put some chat there. So if you're running into any problems during the session, please put a message in the chat and one of our team will be able to assist you. One note with GoToWebinar, if you are using the browser version and you experience audio issues, or you've experienced that the session starts pausing or stopping for some reason, just hit the refresh on the browser or switch to the desktop version. It usually kind of solves that problem. Okay, so with that being said, let's jump into it. We have a lot to get through today, a lot of great stuff, I think a lot of interesting things for everybody to kind of learn about today. Really, what kicked off today's webinar is that a couple of months ago, we actually did our 2020 Automated Software Testing and Quality Summit. We were very fortunate to have a number of great presenters during that one-day session, kicked off by Diego from Forrester, talking about how it's not just about speed of releasing to the market, but it's also about releasing quality at speed. We also had our friends at Fitch Solutions talking about how they really went from having 18 production outages a year with all the associated business continuity issues, and actually taking that to over 100 days without any downtime through the application of a solid quality process. We had our colleagues at IOVIO who have been working with ING on their open banking initiatives, talking about how to do early stage testing and validation. Alaska Airlines and Sabre, both talking about how they could reduce their complexity of their test environment to really focus on testing the impossible and focus on the actual activities of testing and validation rather than worry about their system availability. And last, we were topped off and closed out with Caesars Entertainment, talking about how to communicate the ROI associated with test automation to senior management, talking about different ways that you can calculate the value of test automation to your organization. Now, this was a great session. Everybody spoke for about 15-20 minutes. It was rapid fire. And you can actually, if you weren't able to catch that online, it was actually in November, you can actually watch the rerun here. I put the URL at the bottom of this page along with the QR code. And we're going to be posting links to different things in the chats as we go through. So you'll probably see that pop through in the chat in a few moments. Now, the key thing, obviously, all of these are organizations that have been successful by improving their delivery process through test automation. And we kind of, at the end of the summit, we mapped those to how, what technologies those organizations are leveraging, and how they're kind of using those practices across the Parasoft toolset. So today, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into 3 of those products in a kind of a concise way. We're going to focus on a couple of key use cases around unit testing. We're going to talk about API testing, and we're also going to talk about service virtualization and how we can use that to stabilize our test environment. Now, we're not going to go super deep, but we are going to give you enough of a flavor so you can kind of see how these technologies work. And then we'll give you some additional places where you can find some more information at the end of today's session as well. Also, I've included here a link to the Forrester research from Diego talking about the functional test automation market space. And again, another QR code where you can get access to the full report talking about all different aspects of continuous testing and the challenges organizations face, and as I say, different technologies that are available to you in the market space. Okay, so let's kind of get into it, and it's important as we're going through today's session, we're actually going to be talking about how we can apply different testing techniques to a fictitious example application. This is our fictitious logistics and order management system. As you can see here, I can order aircraft and planes, and we'll talk a little bit about this system that's currently under development, quote unquote. This is kind of a typical scenario that we find in many organizations, is that you're trying to test something. Obviously, it's iterative. You've got a number of moving components, and you may have some complex workflows as well. So this particular application has a few different end user scenarios, and we'll touch upon those and how we can test those with API testing. It also has a workflow where we're going through a purchasing process as well as an approval process from the point of view of my order approval and deployment of different components into different parts of my infrastructure. Okay, so let's talk about how we can test this thing, because obviously, there's a lot of moving pieces. There are a lot of different ways that we could actually test this. And what we're going to do here is we're going to start by talking about how we can test at the lowest level of our testing process. Really, this is the unit testing paradigm, and how I can build, in essence, a solid foundation to my test automation strategy. Here, this is actually something that Fitch Solutions has been leveraging, Parasoft JTest, and it was a key component in their quality process to reduce the number of production outages, as I mentioned earlier. Now, unit testing is a well understood practice, and many of you are probably familiar with this testing pyramid here on the right hand side. It's the bottom layer, basically meaning you want to do a lot of unit testing, less API testing, less automated UI testing because they're more brittle, they're harder to maintain, and then kind of at the top you want to preserve your manual testing efforts to really focus on the valuable exploratory testing practices. But as I said, unit testing is the solid foundation. Why is it unit testing really valuable, and why is it really the piece that can help me build in a process for delivering quality at speed? Well, really, the fundamental piece is they're quick to run, okay? So you can run them as part of your CI pipeline, you can run them continuously. They're also very granular, meaning that they're easy to debug and diagnose, so you can really kind of pinpoint where there a potential problem with this is within the code base. They're also actually a great practice to make sure that your code is well designed. So if you're building or if you're doing unit testing as you're developing your code, you're going to start building test stability into the underlying code base itself. And it kind of really does fundamentally change the thought process of the team, which makes the code ultimately actually easier to maintain and manage over time. But we see many people struggle with unit testing, and really there's multiple reasons why unit testing typically the organizations struggle to scale the adoption of the practice. It does require a development skill set. So here, obviously, we're now focusing on leveraging our development team to do unit testing, which pulls them away potentially from creating functionality. And this is also one of the challenges that many organizations face, is that developers frankly don't like testing. I don't know a developer that wants to deliver poor quality code, but I also don't know a developer that wants to spend a lot of time testing and validating. They want to do that creative piece, which means that often it's skipped. And it's often skipped when you're looking at legacy code bases and areas where you really don't understand the code very well. So you might just kind of gloss over it. And that's really risky, because changes to the code base really represent the number one challenge, or the number one introduction of risk into your application code base. So it is foundational to delivering quality at speed, but it has some challenges. And how can we help with those challenges? This is where Parasoft JTest comes into play. And as I said, the technology that Fitch Solutions is leveraging. Parasoft JTest is an IDE plugin that enables us to create unit tests very quickly, reducing the amount of time and effort associated with the process. So we have one-click creation of test cases by analyzing the code to create and guide the developer through the process. We can help you achieve higher levels of code coverage by cloning and mutating existing tests, as well as automatically creating new tests at targeted parts of the code base. And then we also have mechanisms for actually optimizing the execution of those tests as part of your CICD pipeline, so that you can actually handle the changes in the code base and validate the changes in the code base as the most effective way possible. Now, we're not going to be able to go through all of these pieces, but what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague Nathan, and Nathan will be able to show us how this works inside of the IDE and how we can start kind of getting a jump start on our unit testing practice. So Nathan, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. So today I'm going to go through a couple of different use cases for creating unit tests for my code. The first use case that I is imagining that I'm creating new code and I need to create unit tests for my new code. In this case, I'm actually using some code for this fictitious application that Mark mentioned. And specifically, I'm looking at a class today called shopping cart service, which represents the shopping cart in that application. You'll notice that it's a Spring class, so it's actually a Spring service that has a couple of auto-wired fields. And in today's demonstration, I'm going to show you how I can add unit tests for the method that adds items to the shopping cart. Just to take a quick look so you understand what I'm going to be creating tests for. So the method does some basic validation on the parameters that get passed in. You'll notice that it does some checks to make sure, for instance, the quantity I'm putting in the cart is less than what I have in stock, and basically make sure I have enough in stock. And then it has two main use cases. And so one of the use cases is that I already have an item in the cart and I just need to update the quantity to a new number. And then the other is I don't have anything in the cart yet and I need to add a new item to the cart with a specified quantity. So if I was developing this method, I would want to create unit tests that cover all these different cases and make sure that, in the future, the functionality doesn't break. So I have Parasoft JTest installed into my IDE. So that's what I'm demonstrating on today. It also supports IntelliJ. And what you'll notice as I go through this is that there are, Parasoft JTest has something called the Unit Test Assistant. And there's various views that I'll be interacting with that are context sensitive based on what I'm doing. So the first test case that I want to create in this method is I'm going to handle the case where there's no items in the cart yet and I want to add an item to the cart. So you'll notice this unit test assistant view down here is updated based on my selection. And I'm going to choose the action that'll generate a test case that specifically covers this line of code. So what will happen when I choose this button is that it will analyze this method and identify the different parameter values that need to be set in order to exercise a specific piece of code. It'll initialize the object, it will configure mocks for me, and set the parameters to what they need to be in order to enter this method. So let me go ahead and do that. So I click that, and you'll see that a new test class got created for me. It's a basic JUnit test. We support JUnit 4, JUnit 5, and TestNG. And here's my main test. So you'll see that the shopping cart service got initialized. Some mocks were set up, and specifically those two auto-wired fields that I pointed out were configured with mocks for those. And then you'll see that the method that I'm testing also got called with some values passed to it. Now, the unit test assistant in JTest uses what we like to call a guided testing approach. So you'll notice that there's a number of comments that got placed into the code. And these comments denote places where JTest made some decisions for you about or what the value should be in order to hit a specific piece of code. In this particular scenario, user ID and item ID doesn't really matter what those are, so default values were used. And I'm just going to remove these comments to denote that I reviewed those values and those are what I want. The next value we see is the quantity. So this represents how much I'm putting into the cart. So I'm putting one item into the cart. That makes sense. So I'm happy with that. Next, we'll notice that there are some methods that got created to mock various things. So this first method is one that mocks an item entity class that the unit test assistant identified gets used when this code gets called. And the item entity is how much of a specific item, well, it represents a specific item in the application. And one of the pieces of data it has is how much is in stock. And so you'll notice it's actually setting up the mock for get in stock. And it identified that for this specific use case, if I have at least one item in stock and I'm adding one item to the cart, things should work, right? So I'm also happy with this value, and I'll go ahead and remove that comment. And you'll see there's a number of other methods for setting up other mocks. So let's go ahead and run this method. It should pass, and it will pass. So everything got configured for me, and it's a functioning test case. Now, one thing that is important about unit tests is that they have good assertions. Without assertions, unit tests generally have little value. And we don't have assertions in the test case yet. But the next thing I want to call your attention to is our the recommendations view in JTest. And what the unit test assistant does is as you execute your test, it identifies areas in your test that could potentially be updated or improved. And there's a number of different categories of things it looks at. Right now, I'm going to look at the assertions, and you'll notice that it recognized that there are no assertions in this test, and it identified a number of values that it thinks could be good values to assert on. So I'm going to go ahead and click the action to make the assertions, and you'll notice that with that click, that a number of assertions got added to my test. Now, for this particular use case, I'm really only a handful of them, so I'm going to delete a few of the ones that I don't want, but the ones are the ones that measure how much is in stock after I add something to the cart and what's the quantity in my cart. And so those are the things that I want to assert because that directly relates to the purpose of the test case. So, I had one item in stock, I added one item to the cart. So that means when I'm done, I should have 0 items in stock and 1 item in the cart. So if I go ahead and run this, again, we'll see it passes. So you'll see how in, I don't know how many minutes that was, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, I've created a meaningful test case with assertions. The tool set up all the mocks for me, made that process very easy. If I go back and look at the class that I'm testing, you'll notice that there's these red and green markers. So the tool shows me what lines of code are covered and uncovered at this point in this specific method. And we can see that the branch that I was trying to cover indeed is covered. So let's say that I want to continue creating tests and getting additional coverage. This next branch where I already have an item in the cart would be the next one that I want to do. So I would go through and use the same process to generate test cases for that branch of the code. Now, I'm not going to go through all the steps I just went through, but in general, I go through the same steps where I review the parameter values, adjust any as needed, and add assertions and so on. Then I can run these and I'll see again, that test is a passing test case. And once it runs, we'll see that I'll have updated coverage here in the view. All right. Now, the next thing that's left to cover in this test are exception cases. So you'll notice there's 3 different cases, error cases where exceptions happen. And negative tests are one of those areas where it can be difficult to create unit tests for exception cases or negative use cases. So let's say that I wanted to create a test for the case where I'm adding more items to the cart than I actually have in stock. So I'm going to go through, and again, I'm going to use the same action. The mocks got set up, and this is a test case that's configured to exercise that line of code. However, when I run it, it's actually going to fail. And it fails because it's throwing an exception because actually went into that specific block of code where an exception is thrown. And so we see I've got an exception. If I look down in my recommendations view, it's telling me the exception message says there's not enough inventory. So this is actually an expected case. And you'll see that the tool gives me the facilities to mark it as expected. So I'm just going to choose that. And you'll notice that this little clause got added in the test annotation to mark this as expected. So that's how you do that in JUnit. And now if I go ahead and run it, the test is going to pass. So in this way, you can see I've demonstrated how just with very little effort, I can use this tool to quickly create unit tests that exercise the various branches of my code to achieve high levels of coverage. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is our second use case. So this first use case is related to me creating tests for code that but what if I'm working on an application that doesn't have a lot of tests yet? And I've been told that I need to make changes in the application. If you're like me, I would be scared of the application. And so in a lot of cases, what the best thing to do there is to create unit tests first that capture the current state of behavior of the app before you then go in and start doing your refactoring and adding your new functionality. And so Fitch, which Mark mentioned, that was one of their main use cases, is they had a lot of legacy code that they needed to add test cases to because they needed to update their application. So now I'm switching. I'm going to be in class for my demonstration, but now I'm pretending that this is legacy code that doesn't have tests, and I want to add tests quickly. Now, next, I want to call your attention to this coverage tab. So as I'm running tests, you'll notice that there's these coverage, it's calculating the coverage that's being collected. And if I go look at my shopping cart service, you'll see that I currently have 38% coverage. And the method that I was working on, add item to the shopping cart, is up at 92%. So, I could actually get that to 100 if I covered those two other exception cases. But I have a number of methods that have no coverage. They have no tests. So what I'll show you next is how I can create tests for all of those methods very quickly. So what I'll do here is I'm going to go over to my package explorer, and I'm just going to choose to create tests for this specific class, for the entire class. And I could actually do this at a package level or a project level, but for this demonstration, I'll just do it at the class level. And so I'll come here, I'm going to choose add test cases, and I have a dialog that comes up. Gives me some options about whether I want to create regular tests or parameterized tests, how deep to do initialization of mocks, so on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it that I want to create tests for all methods except for the one that I already created tests for, just because I know I have tests for that one. And I'm going to click OK. And now what the tool is doing is it is going through and using the same technology to create unit tests as I've previously showed you, but it did it for all of them in bulk. So if I look at the outline view for this test class, I had manually created those, with the help of the tool, created those 3 methods, but you'll see now I have 9 more methods got added to my class. And I don't have time today to go through and show you how I update each of them, but you can see that, it did the same thing, creating tests, adding the mocks, and configuring them appropriately. So once I do this, the next step of the process would be to go through and again, review the parameter values. Maybe I need to update some, add assertions as appropriate, and so on. But I just want to show you, if I were to go ahead and run all of these tests, you'll notice now that my coverage is actually quite a bit higher. I have very good coverage in this class once they all run. Some of them are failing. The failing cases are due to exception cases. So there's some negative cases we created tests for. And one thing I should mention is that there were 5 methods that I added tests for. But I told the tool that I wanted to create tests and cover all the different branches. It ended up creating 9 different tests for 5 different methods. So it was identifying different branches that needed to go down, and it created different tests to handle those different branches. So once all the tests run, you'll see, even without any further configuration, I'm now up to 91% coverage in that class. All of my methods now have coverage. and I could, do some tweaking, and I could probably get close to 100%, which, 100% is typically very hard to do in this particular class. So with that, I think that's all that I wanted to show. So Mark, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you, Nathan. So yeah, hopefully, that was a very rapid fire and kind of high level overview of Parasoft JTest and how it can be used to really save time and reduce complexity associated with unit testing. You saw a lot of functionality there where we're able to guide the developer through the process. And really, it's all about trying to test well. And code coverage is one of the ways of testing how well you're testing. Not the only one, but one of them. And as you see there, Nathan achieved high code coverage with just a few clicks. So let's kind of move, though, a little further up our testing pyramid now. Let's start talking about API testing. And this is really, I do personally view as a sweet spot within the testing pyramid. And it gives us the ability to start creating functional scenarios in a way which really facilitates great communication between different roles within the team. They're also very quick to run, very similar to unit testing. They are at a higher level in the pyramid, so they do take a little longer. There's more environmental constraints associated with them, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But they do represent that great way of communicating quickly and giving really the team the ability to diagnose and fix the functional types of regressions pretty quickly and easily. But again, API testing comes with some challenges. Often many test organizations or test team members are given an API and maybe a Swagger document and then say, here you go at it, start testing it. The trouble is you really don't know how the API is intended to be used. You might have some kind of high level documents where you don't really understand how an application is really using it. And it often requires kind of a deep level of skills and understanding to really build out these tests. So what happens is development team have done a great job developing individual services or individual microservices. And then they say, here, testers, go ahead and test. And testers say, oh, I don't kind of know, so I'm going to build something basic. And it ends up in this no man's land in between. So as I said, I do believe that API testing is a real optimal way for doing functional test automation, but it has some technical barriers for it to be a shared responsibility across the team. So what we're going to do is we're going to go now back into our example application. Now, as I mentioned before, this example application is currently in development. So, guess what? It's incomplete. And one of those areas is we don't have enough data. And typically that is one of the challenges when you're trying to do functional testing and validation. You really need meaningful data within your system so you can start testing different conditions. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually populate that with some data from my favorite, brand or franchise, Star Wars. And we're going to start putting some characters in and we're going to start moving them around the ecosystem. Again, this is typically what you would do if you had an application where you don't have any real data yet. You're going to start putting in things where you can build stories around the context that maybe you can draw parallels to. Now, underneath the hood of this application, Nathan's already shown us the Java code, but this is a full end-to-end application here. We've got an AngularJS front end that's driven by some Spring REST APIs. There's internal logic, which is actually routing front-end APIs through to different back-end APIs and external dependencies. And what we're going to see is we're going to see how this is modeled within Parasoft's ecosystem. And this is going to be important when we start talking about the test environment as a whole and how we can eliminate the constraints associated with the test environment. But the thing we're going to be focused on today is, or right now, should I say, is how can we discover how those APIs are used by the front end and how we can take those APIs to create, in essence, tests which will run a lot faster as part of my CICD pipeline, and therefore I can get quicker feedback, and also that are closer to the code in essence. So they're easier to debug, easier to diagnose, and easier to kind of build into a regression suite so that moving forward you can validate to make sure that the issue is being resolved. So with that being said, I'm now going to hand over to Chris And Chris, if you could take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark. All right, so yeah, today my goal is to go through the application that's now moved along the development spectrum and start building some meaningful functional tests against it. So here what we're looking at is the Parasoft continuous testing platform. It's a browser-based representation of all of the functional tools. It hosts a library of API tests, virtual services, test data that you can build, as well as providing that dashboard for the environment diagramming, which we'll discuss in a little bit. There is a desktop version of this available. I'm using the browser because I like some of the collaborative features that are available in here. Now, as Mark indicated, I do have a little bit more of an application now, so let's go ahead and look at this application. And again, it's a logistics management application, but it doesn't exactly have the data that I want. Now, usually when one gets started testing APIs, they look at things like a Swagger definition. And so this application has one built on the Open API spec. And there's a series of services in here that I can use for testing. But I can also use a lot of these for loading information into the application, which is a nice practice when first working with the application. Now, if I were to get started building an API test for this, what I could do is I could load in that service definition, pick the appropriate test cases, and build a nice sequence like I have here. And so that's exactly what this does. This sequence, which was built from the Open API spec, loads the demo application with data. And I like to run this but before any run, just to make sure that the application has the data that I'm expecting, and I can inject that data at any layer of the application, whether it's through a REST service that communicates with the data object, or by maybe communicating directly with the database. And it just creates a nice even playing field. Okay, those tests were all successful, so let's go back home, and there we go. I have a currently under developed a demo application that's now loaded with all sorts of fun data. Now, what I want to do is I want to increase my API coverage here, and I want to be able to build test cases according to specific requirements and use cases that I have. And just like Nathan showed, what I would like to demonstrate is how can I get there as fast as possible. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and log out of the application. And instead of hand stitching those together using the Swagger definition, I'm going to use the Parasoft recorder. The Parasoft recorder enables you to record API traffic from your application just by simply exercising it and build really meaningful API tests that can be automated. I can at the same time build UI tests in pure Selenium, but that's a conversation for a later webinar. I do recommend going to the Parasoft website and taking a look at Selenic if you're interested in Selenium-based UI testing. So here what I'm going to do is just go ahead and start recording my use case. Now, this is typically something that would be defined in my requirement. And so what I'm doing here is manually going through the use case. So now we're going to actually see the demo application's UI. So what I'd like to do is to grab a couple of characters and some other entities and send them for a mission on Mars. And so let's go ahead and just choose some folks. So how about we start with a BB-8? We'll send a BB-8, we'll add that to our cart. This is the class that Nathan was testing earlier from the code level. And then what I'd like to do is send him with some support. So we'll choose some species, and why don't we send him with some Ewoks? Little motley crew there. Okay, so I've got one BB-8, 2 Ewoks, added those to the cart. I'm now going to proceed forward to the submission process. So we'll do a quick review here, make sure that all makes sense. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to deploy these resources to Mars, because I have a mission on Mars, specifically at the station Omega 12. Okay, we'll get the location here. You see this app is currently under development. I'll then assign that to the campaign. Now remember, as I'm interacting with this, I am recording all of those underlying APIs. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to assign this to a mission ID. We'll go ahead and call this 12112. It's just basically a unique identifier. And then my my personal identification code, which happens to be R2D2C3PO, coincidentally. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and look at the review. So here I am sending these artifacts for a mission on Mars at this station under this specific campaign. Everything looks good to me. I'm going to go ahead and submit for approval. Now, what happens next is that this information actually goes into another system for the approval process to take place. Now, that other system actually is also powered by APIs, so I can easily navigate to it and approve my submission. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and log in as the approver of the submission. And here's my other application. I see that a new requisition was opened here. We'll go ahead and click on that, review everything. Okay, BB-8, some EWOCs going to Mars. Everything looks good. We'll go ahead and approve that. And we'll send the response back. And this is typical, multiple systems communicating together to form a workflow. So now that that's been approved, I'm going to go ahead and navigate back into the original system and verify that approval. And so here I get a little notification that indicates that I have a requisition that is approved and automatically deployed. So let's go ahead and pop into that requisition. And I see that I've got my BB-8 and my EWOC going to, Neptune. Well, that's a problem. So it looks like there's some kind of bug inside of the application. It's deliberate, but I would like to figure out exactly what's happening. Now, fortunately, I was recording that whole sequence. So what I can do is I can stop my recording and I can create an automated API test for that. So we'll say the Parasoft developed application, webinar. And then, of course, I had some requirements that I was building these for. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in the requirement information so I can get traceability and understand how to prioritize defects as they come up. So I'm going to go ahead and create test asset. Now, here's where we're going to see the AI at work. So what's happening here is that it's the Parasoft solution is taking a look at that traffic, looking for patterns and relationships. It's then going to stitch together for me an API test that I can use. Okay, so here we're back into the Parasoft ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and search for that test. Okay, there it is. This is the one that I just created. And if we take a look at this test, we see a couple of things. One, all of the calls to those services have been recorded. And it's created, nice UIs around each one of those so that I can, build those API tests. You'll also notice that there's a series of smart tools. And what these smart tools are doing is automatically extracting data, passing them to subsequent test cases. And you'll also see down here, smart assertions. As Nathan indicated, you need to add assertions into your tests so that you can automate the validation process. Now, one other thing has happened, which is pretty powerful. You'll notice here that I have a test suite reference. Well, what is this? Now, so this test suite reference was added automatically by SOATest because it knew the test needed it. And you know what this test suite reference is? It's a reference to that original test that I created to set up my test environment. You see, through machine learning, we can train the underlying AI to do specific things for our organization. In this case, I know that every time I touch this API, I need this data loading sequence. And so it'll automatically add that in to my test case. And I can continue to use and train the solution, and it just keeps getting smarter. So let's go ahead and run this test case. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually running those API tests against the application. Sorry, I'm trying to get it so we can see the application in the background. Basically emulating those sequences that I was doing from the UI at the API layer. And so this will take just a second. And if I could get my browser to respond appropriately, we'll actually see some things happening in the background here as it's going through the use case, because there's an automatic approval process, and then it uses those APIs to validate that. Okay, this test has passed right out of the box. So let's go ahead and take a look at that report. Now, this report indicates to me all the different APIs that were called. In this particular case, 350 different tests that executed. spanning a series of APIs, but coverage is important here too. And so this report is indicating to me what resources I'm covering in this particular use case. And so I want to strive to get that coverage level up as high as possible. And in just a couple of minutes, I was able to go from a manual requirement into an automated API test that I could run as a part of my build process. But I know that there's a problem. I know that that test is that region is showing up as Neptune when it should be showing up as Mars. And so where's the actual problem? Well, I've done a little background work, and that really was just searching the test case for the words Mars and Neptune. And I found out that it's actually, the bug is introducing down here around test 60. So at some point after I log in as the approver, I go ahead and I put an order. And when I put the order, the response payload comes back and says, yep, you're putting that to Mars. But for some reason, when I then go and get that order again, the order from the approver is saying Neptune. So there's something happening in the approval process. Now I have something great that I can now provide back to development, but I want to build some automation so that I'm asserting this all the time. Now I can actually leverage a couple of pieces that were automatically built for my test. So the first one here is this data bank. So this data bank knew that it needed status because it was passing it to another test. I want region though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an extraction and just navigate my payload and find that region. And I'll see I'll automatically pick a nice XPath. And then I'm just going to name the variable something nice here, put region. Now what I'm doing here is I'm building additional dynamic data exchange between my test cases. In the subsequent order, when I have my assertion, I can come in here and I notice that it actually already has a region set up, but it's doing a fixed value Neptune. Well, now because I have put region, I can simply provide that put region as a dynamic value that will be assigned to this. So I can assert that the region that's put and then ultimately validated is flexible, even if I data drive my test. So I'll go ahead and save this. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this test case one more time. So we'll go back up to the top, click on this, we'll run. Of course, it's going to go through the process of loading the demo app again from scratch, which makes a nice repeatable test environment. It's going to go through that workflow and then apply an automatic validation. This time it failed. Let's go ahead and take a look at the report. So same report, but I have one test that failed. If I jump down here, I notice, well, look at that. It's orders. The region actual value is Neptune, but it should have been Mars. I can hand this right over to the development team as well as the API test, and they'll know exactly where to look, which is going to significantly reduce the total time from identification to remediation of this defect. And so with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you, Mark, to take us to the next section.
Great, thanks, Chris. And you know, we just touched briefly there on some of the capabilities of Parasoft JTest, and I think one of the key things to take away from what Chris showed us is that we're really able to unlock the power of the UI and how it uses the underlying APIs to really accelerate the process of really helping organizations adopt API testing. Just to kind of step through Chris's workflow again a little bit here. You know, he was recording in the web browser, passing that through the engine that really analyzes and pulls out the relationships to create his API test scenario. The thing that was also really interesting, though, is that he was modifying that API test scenario and adding it into our test repository. Now, that test repository can be populated with tests that you created through this workflow or tests that you created directly from the Swagger document, but that repository has a lot of human intelligence within it. So what we're able to do is actually analyze that human intelligence and use it to extract out templates that can train your brain to be smarter. So as Chris showed us, we're able to kind of inject, for example, setup routines that every time you're touching a certain application, you should run a typical setup scenario. You can also build in assertion frameworks, parameterization frameworks, and things which can say, okay, when you see this type of thing, do this type of behavior. Now, this workflow is super powerful from the point of view of extracting out those front-end APIs through the use of manual testing scenarios. But Chris also showed you very briefly through the use of the UI is that we can also create Selenium tests for testing the front end directly from that Parasoft recorder. And actually, those same Selenium tests can be used to drive the API test generator at runtime. So you can take your existing Selenium tests, for example, and convert them through to API tests through the use of automation as well. So all in all, this is great because what I can do now is I can now start to build out a much broader set of API tests, kind of filling out that middle part of the pyramid, leveraging the top parts of the pyramid, my manual testing activities as well as my UI automation. But really, there's a last piece of the puzzle here, and that's how can we run these tests not just in an automated manner, but continuously. And really, you know, this was talked to really well by both Sabre and Alaska Airlines around the challenges within their test environment and how it would slow down the testing process. So to enable your tests to run continuously, you need three things. The first is your test environment needs to be available. And typical constraints and challenges that I'm going to see in that kind of scenario is where a downstream system requires a scheduled access, such as a mainframe, for example, or maybe there's that paid access of a downstream system, such as a third-party credit checking functionality, for example. You also might run into similar challenges and constraints in an agile development model where multiple teams are developing dependent systems, and you might have a microservice that is currently out of sync with the prime functionality you're trying to test. It doesn't quite have the functionality you need today, so it's not available yet because it's not finished. The second is scalable. You need to be able to scale your test environment, both from the point of view of making sure that you have enough environment or environments available for the team to be able to test without collisions. One of the challenges we often see around test data management is where an organization, everybody's kind of playing in the same sandbox, and then one team will start using a record within the database that the other team is already using, which means that you're going to affect each other's test scenarios, and you're going to see instabilities within your test automation and not really know why. And that is obviously kind of one of the challenges associated with the shared environments. Also, you need to be able to scale the system if you want to be able to do any kind of early stage performance testing. So are you going to be able to handle the load from multiple teams, especially if one of those teams is trying to stress test their component that has that external dependency? And then the third but final piece is all around is your backend dependency controllable? So I might have a microservice that I can stand up on demand through a Docker container, deploy it within the cloud. So I have in the cloud. So I don't have any issue associated with availability. I, in theory, don't have any issue with scalability either, because I can stand up multiple instances of those. But the question is, can I make that microservices do what I want it to do to test my current scenario? So can I actually drive it with the right data? Can I simulate the behavior that I want? For example, exception type of behavior that Nathan was talking about earlier is often difficult to reproduce in a fully assembled environment. And then last, if I'm trying to do early stage performance testing, can I control the performance characteristics of my downstream dependencies? Can I push it to the limit so that my downstream dependency responds much, much quicker than it would do in production? But I want to see if my system can handle that, and vice versa. What happens if that downstream dependency is much slower at responding than it would do normally? So this is where that test environment view that Chris showed us at the beginning really kind of comes into play. And here's how we can actually start to leverage that environment view to control my test environment and reconfigure it, and leverage service virtualization to remove those constraints. So Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you again. And then if you could kind of show us how, in a 5-10 minute demonstration, but give us the flavor of how we can control that environment and how we can create this type of
Absolutely.
dependencies.
Thanks, Mark. So now that I have all of my test cases, I want to go ahead and run those as a part of a continuous process. And so I'm going to go back here to the dashboard and just point out this test environment again. I would then associate the test cases that I have to the specific test flows, and then I could test in different environments. Now, what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and put this into a pre-prod or an integration environment. But I'll notice before I even run my first test case, I've got a problem, right? I've got an endpoint that's offline. And what that manifests like in my application is, if I were to log into the application, I notice that this, let me actually provision. I notice that this availability region is broken. Now, it's just a UI element at this point, so maybe I can continue on with my use case. So I'll just add somebody to the requisition, go to my cart, proceed to submission. Oh, now I'm blocked, right? Because that external dependency is an essential part of my test flow. Not to worry though, because ahead of time, what I was able to do with the live system was, I'm going to just drill down into this a little bit. I can record transactions against the actual systems and create a virtual representation of those services. Very similar to what you saw when I was creating the API test. It uses underlying heuristics to link things together and to create a simulated version of that service. So I'm just going to pull one out of the oven here that I have created, and I'll go ahead and reconfigure the application so that it talks to that service. No need to restart it. And then if I were to go back into this application and reload this page, now I'm using virtual data. And this allows me to proceed forward with my use case. But as Mark indicated, I want to be able to configure and to have high levels of access and control over this service. And so this is where test data really comes in. So test data, as everybody knows, is an essential part of any testing strategy for any type of testing that you're doing. In this particular case, when I recorded this use case, it built a data set for me that I can then manipulate here on the fly. So when I'm actually pulling that, I'm pulling an array of items. And so here's the actual array that I see. But the cool part is that since I control this data, I can easily come in and say, you know what, I want to do something that doesn't actually exist in the real world. Maybe we'll create a planet called Hoth, right? So I'll go ahead and save this. And then I go back into my application, reload that data. And then right here, I now have access to that. If I want to take that even further, I can take this data and have Parasoft represented as a model. And in the model, I can drill down to specific aspects, understand the different data objects that make that up, and then easily generate or mask data that I recorded in an easy way so that I can create whatever types of data that I need, and then I can inject that into my test cases. I can inject that into my virtual services, create whatever type of environment that I want for the type of testing that I'm doing, and then be able to really free up any constraints that I have in my test environment. Okay, so for that then, Mark, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you.
Great, thank you, Chris. And I'm actually just looking through the questions here as well. So some great questions have come in. I don't know how much time we'll actually have, but please feel free to throw more questions into the pile, and I'll kind of look at those at the end. So so now we have an environment where we have control. Say Chris can kind of give us a very brief overview of how you can enable an environment there, and that really gives an individual the control and access to the test environment and the dependencies. But more importantly, actually what we showed you there, that representation of the test environment and its pre-configured constructs can be leveraged as part of a CICD pipeline. So imagine that I'm going through my CICD pipeline, I check my code in, and then I start doing kind of my appropriate types of testing and quality process. We actually haven't touched upon code analysis in today's presentation at all, but certainly code analysis is a key component in that, and really, really the foundation in my mind around how you can build quality into your software development process. But as Chris would put it, a topic for a different webinar. So as I'm moving through my pipeline, I get to my functional performance or penetration testing, and this is where I can start to stamp out different instances of my test environment and reconfigure them dynamically. Obviously, leveraging things like Docker and cloud-based hosting environments gives me the ability to have dynamic, truly dynamic test environments. And then I can collect data from across my testing process and bringing all of that together into one centralized view of quality and cross-correlating that back with my original business requirements. This is really where the Parasoft DTP, our reporting and analytics platform, really comes in to its own. So you can bring the data from across your quality process, bring it into that single pane of glass, and then, as I said, correlate that back into your agile planning or requirements management process. So we did go through a lot today, and we really did only scratch the surface. But we wanted to highlight the key technologies that were discussed during that automated software testing and quality summit. Parasoft JTest, we started with Nathan talking about how we could reduce the time and effort associated with creating meaningful and maintainable unit tests. Here you'll see we've got a QR code, and actually we're going to be posting the links to these documents in the chat as well. But we have an ebook here, which is actually a collection of a lot of really good best practices and useful information for how developers can really improve their unit testing practice as a whole. Next, we started looking further at the pyramid with Parasoft JTest and how we could use API testing to really have the most efficient test automation process. We didn't talk about it today, but this really is a great springboard into shift left or continuous performance testing. I talked about that a little bit within service virtualization concepts, and this is obviously where Parasoft Virtualize comes in, where we can remove those test environments or remove the constraints within your test environment. There is actually a community edition version of Parasoft Virtualize as well, which is available for individuals to use within their local environments. So I would definitely invite you to check that out. But we've got 2 white papers here that we're linking to around the key capabilities that you need for API testing and service virtualization. Okay, so I'm going to leave this up while I look at the questions. It looks like we have like a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to look through these and actually pick ones for each of the topic areas. Okay, so we have an IDE question for you, Nathan, which you already answered. I think you did close from IntelliJ. So the question for you, Nathan, here. So can non-developers use JTest to create unit tests? I think that's a really good question, especially considering that often many organizations think of a unit testing as a developer-driven activity. But that is something that I have been asked before at conferences in the past. So why don't you go ahead and take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps to have some programming knowledge, but you can see from what I created that how I use Parasoft JTest, that a lot of the code gets created for me. So it enables people who don't have as much development experience, maybe they just have basic understanding, or they don't have to have super deep knowledge of mocking frameworks and so on. It allows them to create test cases. So we've seen in some clients that they're able to use separate teams of people that didn't even develop the code in order to generate test cases for that code using the tool. I think it really helps people who don't have that much development experience create tests as well.
Yeah, and I think that another one of our clients who's leveraging JTest within their organization is doing exactly that. Is trying to kind of train and empower the team that have not traditionally been doing unit testing with kind of the best practices and kind of reducing that initial technical hurdle. Okay, something for you, Chris, here. You've got 3 that I'm going to kind of read all 3 out to you, and they kind of all kind of talk, but to the similar kind of things. Like, so how can, and it's talking about JTest here, obviously, and kind of the general strategy, but how could this help with UI testing? Another one is, if I create API tests for the UI, do I still need to test the UI? And then, then there's another one here. Is there anything in addition to JTest that you would need to test your UI for UI tests? So I think there's a number of things which kind of all cross correlate there. So why don't you go ahead and take that one, and I'll just pick one more before we wrap up.
Sure. So when it comes to UI testing, yes, UI testing is still a vital aspect of the test pyramid, but as Mark indicated, your ability to create rich unit tests and API tests reduces the number of UI tests that you'll ultimately need, and also you'll be able to discover issues earlier in the testing process through those unit and API tests, which will help you then get confidence when building the API tests. Now, as far as SOA test is concerned, UI testing is an integrated component into SOA test. It allows you to, as a function of creating your API tests, also build browser clients where you can interact with the browser. Now, you're doing that kind of testing really to support your API testing. Maybe you have an OAuth use case where you need to actually grab a token from a browser, or maybe you just need to click a couple of buttons and really validate the UI. So those pieces are included. Now, when it comes to fully validating the UI from a functional perspective, we have a solution called Parasoft Selenic, which we didn't cover today, but it allows you to, through recording, create pure Selenium tests in the page object model. Those tests are then created in JUnit 4, JUnit 5, or TestNG, and can be run without Parasoft. And it just helps you jumpstart that Selenium testing practice. We do create them with the page object model, so they are in that best practice. And then, of course, there's a nice synergy between the UI testing component and SOA test, because as Mark indicated earlier, you can then convert those Selenium tests into API tests. The reason that it's quite powerful, though, is that there's AI in that solution as well, that as those Selenium tests execute, you'll get AI-powered recommendations and self-healing, which should be a similar paradigm from the things that you've been seeing today.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring in Parasoft Selenic there, especially if you're doing 100% UI testing within the test scenario, then Selenium, should I say, is your great direction to go, and Parasoft Selenic can really kind of help you get a jump start on that, as well as help you address the issues associated with maintainability of the brittle UI-centric tests. But as you also say, Chris, when you're testing your API, you often want to integrate other workflows into that. So you want to, OAuth is a great example. You're going to need to leverage the UI to get your tokens to be able to pass them through the APIs, but also you might want to actually talk to the backend database or an ESB or another external system as part of validating a true end-to-end scenario with SOA test, and all of those things are available within that technology as well. Okay, so I think that's about all we have time for. There's some other great questions, but actually we'll take those and answer those offline. Actually, one of them is actually really interesting, potential future webinar around how do I know when I'm done testing. I think there's a good conversation there around different types of coverage. So certainly we'll take that one up in a follow-on conversation. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week as we get towards the end of the year. So take care. Thanks very much.